Welcome to our Are You Ready for Enterprise Plus webinar. As Irene said, my name is Mark Galpin. As a product manager at JFrog, I've been fairly closely involved in developing Enterprise Plus and working with customers on the initial assessments. And I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you about Enterprise Plus. Now, as we start talking about Enterprise Plus, I kind of want to bring you back to the vision and concept that the JFrog team as a whole had as we did it. And that really starts with, who are we talking to? Who did we think the people were who needed something new for their binary management? So one of the first groups that we really identified as needing a new solution were what we sometimes call the super DevOps teams. These are central tools teams that may be serving thousands of developers around the globe. And they typically want easier tools, better tools, greater insight into their projects that they're running. Another major group that we identified that we thought we could do more to help were people that were working on cloud migrations. You're working on complex architectures, possibly multi-cloud, that really wanted tight control over what happened throughout that. We've had many customers doing cloud migrations, but if you need that extra layer of control, there was definitely something missing. And finally, we really wanted to talk to people who were primarily concerned with what happens after an artifact is released. People that have to manage activities and the distribution of artifacts across multiple sites and network segments. And we found people like this in a variety of different areas, such as the gaming industry, in people that have to worry about retail locations or point of sale, or customer service, or IoT. And as we spoke to these customers, we identified 4 key problems that we want to solve. And hopefully you recognize these problems as problems you may have as well. So first, we have the question of visibility and intelligence. Can you be data-driven in DevOps processes? Can you get data from multiple tools? Second is a matter of scaling complexity. As I mentioned, we live in an era where centralized tools teams are managing vast architectures across multiple organizations. And how do they simplify this problem so that a relatively small number of people can manage a complex architecture? There's the problem of trust. We find every time I go to a conference, every time I speak with customers, they tell me that this matter of trusting the DevOps process and trusting the security of binaries is becoming more important every single year. And finally, overcoming physics. How do you get your binaries where they need to be? And this is a problem that is really very central to JFrog's DNA. We've been worrying about how to get binaries from point A to point B and how to make sure that they're available and ready for as long as we've been a company. And we came to realize that as we've gotten to this new generation of DevOps requirements, that this problem needed some new solutions as well. And as I bring these tools together, we realized that what we needed was a platform to solve the problem. And that we needed to sit between where source code begins and where it ends. So if you're using a modern DevOps environment, and maybe you're using Kubernetes, you could say we sit between Git and Kubernetes. And so these tools are available. So you have JFrog Artifactory, JFrog bin tray that we've had before, JFrog mission control and insight, Xray, access. So Artifactory remains the storage solution of choice. And hopefully, if you're doing this, you're already using it or already considering it. We have bin tray or JFrog Distribution for distributing binaries. And distribution, as I said, has become a much more complicated task in the last couple of years. It's no longer necessarily just, oh, I'm going to build a binary and deploy a single SaaS service. You may have devices out on the edge. You may have a point of sale service. You may have many things that need to be updated. And of course, you have the matter of JFrog Xray with the careful recursive scanning of packages so that you know exactly what is in your software development pipeline and why it's there. Now, after we brought these ideas, we validated them through a beta test. And this is a picture of the great people from many different sectors. We had people from the retail sector, people from the technology sector, people from the banking sector, people from the medical sector, all involved in assessing Enterprise Plus, validating its direction. And I'm going to tell you some great things about Enterprise Plus and hopefully some use cases that are really going to excite you. But I also encourage you to go out and check out the YouTube. Panelists from Align Tech in the medical devices and Capital One and Fidelity from the banking industry spoke at SwampUp about their experiences with Enterprise Plus. So if you want a perspective of somebody outside JFrog, what did they think of Enterprise Plus? I encourage you to check out that YouTube video. So let's get into our problems. And the first problem is this problem of visibility and intelligence. How do you get to the next level of DevOps? How do you know where your bottlenecks are? Really, this is about process improvement. We've known for a long time, from the very first process improvement lecture I ever took, right? The first thing we were told is you have to measure things, because if you can't measure them, you can't improve them. So how do you start doing that? And we spent a lot of time thinking about the DevOps process. And part of what we saw is that as you go from planning to testing to writing source code and CI analysis, distributing, monitoring, deploying, all of these things today rely on Artifactory and use Artifactory. The centrality of Artifactory to the DevOps process puts us in a unique position to understand what's going on in your DevOps environment. And so we wanted to start by leveraging the data that naturally flows through the Artifactory server. And so we brought some pretty basic goals as a starting point. And that is that we wanted to have a single place where we want insights into the software release cycle. We want to correlate the metrics between JFrog's tools and the tools in the ecosystem. We want eventually to have extensibility so you can build out those metrics and dashboards yourself. And eventually we'll want REST APIs to query those metrics. Now, this is a great vision for Insight, but Insight is a very new tool. So we wanted to start with a simple scoped project that would start to give you an idea of what this is about and allow us to start collecting feedback from customers on what they really need and where we need to go next. And so to begin with, we took 4 tools that we know our customers really care about, and that is Git, Jenkins, Artifactory, and Xray. And we wanted to use those to correlate the data that we could get from those 4 tools as based on the data from the Artifactory build info to answer a couple of simple questions. Are we release ready? Is the build success rate staying high and our test passing? What does the security vulnerability rate look like? How is the consumption of storage changing data? So it's not just release ready, it's are we using our resources well? Storage consumption is one of the major things that people tend to start worrying about. And it tells you critical information about what's going on in your DevOps process. So let's take a look at this insight capability. So first of all, we have single sign-on here. So I'm actually going to log out and then log back in again. And you'll see here, if I go to jfrog.local, it actually directs me to mission control, and then it redirects me to Artifactory. It redirects me back to where I was starting. So this is a cool feature. As we started integrating the platform, we thought that SSO was a necessary part of this work. So then we go into a new tab of JFrog Mission Control. So you may have used Mission Control with a previous subscription, with our Enterprise subscription. It's not unique to Enterprise Plus. But we now have this Projects tab that you can use. And if I bring up the Projects tab, so I can create a new project, first of all. And I can choose an Artifactory service that I want to analyze from. And then I can select individual builds that I want to use. Or I can select builds based on a pattern. So I could do step star. And then I've got all of these steps builds that I can put together. And it will take a little while to load the data, so I'm going to go to one that's preloaded. And here you can start seeing some basic data about what's going on in my builds. So I can see how often are people committing to the different projects in my build. And this is acquired through Jenkins, how many commits are going into each build. How long is each build taking? So this is, again, acquired from Jenkins. How long did it take to execute the build? How many dependencies are happening in my build? When I run a build, how long does it take? How many dependencies do they use when I go to the builds? How much storage is a build consuming? So the first three are telling me a little bit about what's going on in the build, but now I'm looking at, during the build, how much storage is it consuming? If this changes drastically, this might mean something is kind of going a little bit weird with my Docker layers. Or the number of promotions that happen in a build. How many of my builds are getting promoted? If most builds aren't getting promoted, then this is probably a sign that something is pretty wrong. And then, of course, you get into important metrics related to security, the joys of live demos, where you start talking about how many security vulnerabilities are there. And I can look per build how many security vulnerabilities I have in each build. And this, if this graph changed, it's because I was on a 7-day time zone and now I'm on a 24-hour one. And then how many of the artifacts that have been built have never been downloaded. And this might indicate that maybe I can do more aggressive cleanup policies if I'm seeing lots and lots of artifacts that have never been downloaded. And that's the base concept that Insight provides. It's a fairly simple set of graphs for now. But as time goes on, this can give you some fairly good insight into what's happening in a project. And we're building on this every single quarter. We're adding more capabilities to the insight effort. Now, staying with the theme of mission control, we have the question, how do we scale complexity? How do you simplify and map the complexity of your organization? And the reason this comes up is most often related to topologies. So when Artifactory started, topologies tended to be pretty simple. In many cases, you only had a single Artifactory server, or maybe you had an Artifactory server on the East Coast and an Artifactory server on the West Coast. We find today that many of our customers have increasingly complex topologies. So you may have a star topology, for example, where you have a centralized build server where people are consuming the data from those builds in places around the globe. Or even more complex, you may have a mesh topology where you're collaborating and building in many locations around the globe, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 locations around the globe that you have to address. And we even find that customers are starting to combine these topologies. So if you have a multi-cloud architecture, you may have some sort of single pipeline between clouds and mesh topologies within each cloud. Or people are taking a mesh topology or a mesh and star topology, and they want to have a single URL that addresses every Artifactory around the globe. And Artifactory Enterprise does a great job with this if what you need is just to worry about the artifacts being the same everywhere. But one of the things that people reported back to us is that the security was different, or that they had to work hard to keep the security in sync. And so you can do some things with mission control in Artifactory Enterprise to ensure that when you create a permission target, you create it everywhere. But people really wanted to automate this. And so we introduced the concept of access federation. And so with access federation, you can set up mesh or star topologies where you have immediate replication of any ACLs. Any permission targets that you create go everywhere. Any user profile data that gets updated is automatically shared across the globe. And this way, a user can use a single secret to log into any server across the globe. Additionally, with the access service, we also incorporated the SSO for across the entire platform. So everything within the circle of trust, you sign in once and you can log into any server. And this is a really great capability. So to see what this is like, we go back to JFrog Mission Control. And when we look at mission control, we have this concept that we've introduced of sites. And within a site, you have multiple services. So this is sort of the central site. So you see that it has an Artifactory, it has a distribution, it has a Jenkins, it has an Xray. You can see that this Artifactory has this little key next to it, which represents that it's also the source of our Artifactory instances, permissions and authentications with access. You can see that it's connected to the India site. And I have an India site over here, which also has an Artifactory. And then I have two other sites, which are edge nodes. And we'll talk more about edge nodes as this goes onwards. And adding a service is as simple as selecting a type of service, giving it a name, a URL, providing proxy information, and identifying what site it belongs with. And then once you have a service, you can perform various actions like scripting actions that can be executed across multiple services in different sites. Now, when it comes to access federation, with this new capability, we have a fairly simple process. I say that I want to apply a topology. I pick a mesh or a star topology that I want to create. And then I say, what instances do I want to be part of that topology? So in this case, I'm doing a mesh topology, and I can say I want all of the instances to be part of this topology. We'll automatically do them. I then select the entity types. So you have the option of individually replicating just users, just groups, just permission targets, or just access tokens. And then it tells you what you're going to do. And after you've done it, it gives you a map of what's going on. So in this case, we can see that each instance is mapped to the other three. So this is a mesh topology. Now, our third problem that comes up is this matter of trust. Can you trust your binaries and bring that trust into your DevOps process? Now, why do you care? Well, people are starting to use open source a lot more. And this is really what has driven so much of the acceleration of software development over the last decade. And you can see in these charts that I've got here, you can see on the left here, you see we have this scenario where the number of modules that are available in the different central repositories for various technologies has been going steadily up over the last year. But then here on the right, there's a very interesting study that was done to just assess how old are the typical Docker images that are available on Docker Hub. When were they last updated? And generally, if you talk to security experts about the security of an OS, right? They're going to talk about needing to update every couple of weeks, every month. Even on the official latest images, you see ones that go out to half a year before they've last been updated. And this means that even when you think you're getting an official source, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the security vulnerabilities are properly addressed. And this is something that needs to be very carefully paid attention to. So JFrog Xray is the solution to this. And we wanted it to really work with a couple of basic principles. First of all, we wanted it to be universal. It doesn't support every single package type that Artifactory does, but it does support all of the most popular packages. We wanted this radical transparency concept, this idea that you could have a Docker container, and inside that Docker container, there might be a WAR file, and inside that WAR file, there might be a jar file, and inside that jar file, there might be another jar file. This ability to unpack layer by layer and get every binary component and subcomponent that relates. We also really wanted to do metadata tracking and assess both the metadata inside the package and allow you to add more. But all of this is fairly basic discussions of security tools. The real key for us was that you need to be able to shift this all left and have a native integration with Artifactory and have it ready to work in your pipeline so that in your automation, you're getting direct feedback on the security of your binaries. And to us, that was the critical piece that had been missing for so many people before. Now, there's lots of really great webinars on our site related to JFrog Xray. I encourage you to check them out and get a much more in-depth view of what Xray is. It's not per se something that's limited to the Enterprise Plus product, although it is included in all Enterprise Plus packages. But in case you haven't checked out Xray recently, and hopefully you've checked out Xray before, I just want to share with you a couple of things that have happened in the past year that you may find interesting. So of course, at the beginning of the year, we implemented the Grapheus API, which is an open standard API that we're working with a number of different companies in the metadata space for managing metadata. In April, Xray became highly available. As we started to have more and more people depend on JFrog Xray for their pipelines, they needed that same level of availability and reliability they were getting from Artifactory. We introduced Ruby and Python wheels to Xray in May, and we're just about to release 7-zip support and the about box generation. So this is something really new. We've had security data for a while. We've also been collecting license data for a while, but something that we're really excited to have is this idea that it will automatically give you a license report on a software release, telling you what open source licenses are used and what products are using which licenses. So, and of course, this ties in to the JFrog Insight that we saw earlier, so that you can start saying how over time are security vulnerabilities increasing or decreasing. Now, the final problem that I want to talk about is the problem of overcoming physics. How do you get your binaries where they need to be? And as I said, this problem is probably deepest into the DNA of JFrog, at the core of our vision for binary management. And we've had artifact replication. We talked about topologies during the SDLC earlier. But now we also have a concept of JFrog distribution. So JFrog distribution is a new workflow for managing release distribution. So where Artifactory replication focuses on artifacts as they're going through the SDLC, as you're developing them, as you're collaborating on them, distribution is about what happens next. After you've finished an artifact, developers are done with it, it's ready to go, it's been tested, it's ready to get to wherever it's going to be used. How do you get it there? And so we created this concept of the release bundle as a workflow that bundles up all of the components that you may need to ship to a certain location and allows you to use that for distribution to data centers, to retail point of sale locations, to update software that's running potentially at customer sites. And we wanted to make sure that this gave you the flexibility. You know, in the past, we had JFrog bin tray, which allowed you to do some of these things through the cloud. But many of our customers shared that they needed to do something that they controlled with their own infrastructure. So we wanted distribution to work both ways. So what do these use cases look like? So one of these use cases is provisioning data centers. So maybe you've got to provision software in the private or public cloud. Maybe you've got a hybrid architecture. Maybe it spans multiple clouds across the globe. And distribution allows you then to control what goes out. So many customers come to me and they talk to me about the fact that when they're building out their hybrid cloud architectures from the beginning, right, there's some things that need to stay on-prem and some things they want to share out to the public cloud. And especially in regulated industries, it's a very tightly limited list of things that they want to put out on the public cloud, and they want to understand that very well. Other customers are more concerned about the global aspects of this. One of the things that we did during the beta was test distribution to China. And China is traditionally a challenging problem from a network physics perspective, because anytime you're crossing the Great Firewall, the network isn't so great. And it's not just places like China. There are people that have to distribute to, you know, islands or other places that maybe just don't have, you know, sort of the high network connectivity that you can expect between, you know, major data centers on the east and west coast of the United States. We also talked to people who needed to distribute to customers. And customers aren't necessarily just end customers. It may have been partners. It may be customers within another business unit of their organization. One of the big things that came out with this sort of use case is that you really need to have that same fine-grained control over entitlements and permissions that they're accustomed to from Artifactory. Even though you don't need everything in Artifactory to go there, you still need a very smart node on the edge with very complex edge nodes. You can't just put a cache out there that's open to everybody to get things if you're distributing out to customers. So I've talked a little bit about this concept of edge node, and we introduced, as part of the distribution concept, we introduced a new type of Artifactory, the Artifactory edge node. And the Artifactory edge node is a read-only Artifactory instance, which only receives artifacts through distribution. So very, very tight control of what goes on it. Beyond that, it's a pretty normal Artifactory. You can retrieve artifacts any of the standard ways. If people want to use their tools, such as Yum, such as Docker, Maven, etc., you can use that. You have all of the security controls that you're accustomed to on a standard Artifactory. And perhaps most importantly, while the Artifactory edge node is a new type of Artifactory server, which you can use in conjunction with distribution, distribution also works with standard Artifactory servers that you can use in the dev lifecycle as well. And many people find that this is useful because they may be using the same Artifactory server for two purposes. It may be, on the one hand, running some tightly controlled operations in a cloud, but also there may be some collaboration project that they're doing also using that same public Artifactory node with other teams that need a public cloud infrastructure for their builds. JFrog Distribution itself becomes a centralized platform for provisioning release distributions. You get a release bundle, which functions as that bill of material for your software releases. You select carefully what goes in it. And then it's secure. So a release bundle is signed to ensure that you have credibility of what you have. You have still permissions and enforcement of who can consume the data from a release bundle. And you also have traceability and auditability. You know who created the release bundle, where the release bundle was distributed to, whether it got everywhere successfully, everything you need to know about it. Finally, one of the things that we really wanted to focus on was performance. We actually have a patent pending improvement to the replication mechanism where we really focused on problems like this problem of distributing to China or moving very large artifacts to places in the globe that don't have really solid network connections. So I've talked a little bit about there being a new workflow. What does that workflow look like? So to start with this workflow, the first step is that somebody contacts distribution either via the UI or via the REST API to create a release bundle. And a release bundle is a query against Artifactory for a set of artifacts. And it performs a one-time snapshot of that query, capturing the checksums of the artifacts that respond to it. And then you start the distribution process. So once you've created a release bundle, then you can set it up to distribute to edge nodes. And the edge nodes, you contact distribution, you say, where can I distribute to? It will ask mission control what edge nodes exist. And then it starts a transaction with each of these edge nodes. So this is one of the key things about distribution that is different from our other mechanisms of moving binaries, is that you move a set of artifacts completely atomically. So distribution notifies the source Artifactory, and the source Artifactory automatically starts transmitting artifacts to each individual Artifactory edge node that it's going to. And then only after all of the artifacts have been moved to an individual edge node does it notify distribution, and then the transaction is closed and those artifacts are promoted to a way that makes them visible to end users. And this can be consumed in all of the standard ways through Artifactory, but you can also run a query and ask for data about an individual release bundle. So the idea with distribution is that you have a new workflow. It's certificate signed. You still have tight permissions over who can consume what artifacts. You have solid traceability. and you have a patent pending algorithm to improve the distribution across the globe. Let's take a look. So back to mission control. And as I said, our node in the US is where all of our centralized services are located. And here's my distribution service. And again, you can see it getting the single sign-on from Artifactory, and then coming in. And distribution is a fairly simple UI. It really only has two sessions, an admin tab that allows you to set permissions on who can do what in distribution, and release bundles. And if I want to create a release bundle, I can do a couple of different things. So let's jump out to an Artifactory server and look for some artifacts. So I have in here, I have Docker app. And I'm going to look at the properties of my artifacts. Go out to this manifest.json. I see that it has a number of interesting properties that I can take. I'm going to go based on the build. Step 3, create Docker image product, build number 168. So I'm going to set a version number. I'm going to select a source Artifactory, Artifactory US, and click to add a new query. I can select a repository here. And my build name was step 3-create Docker image product. 3, create Docker image product. And the build number is 168. I could do the same thing by searching for the property name or by adding additional capabilities through the AQL, through the artifact patterns. And then I can show the AQL that it generates with the repository. I can preview the artifacts that it's going to pull down with this query. And hit save here. I also have the option of inserting release notes here. And then I can see the specs for this activity. And this one has never been distributed. Let's look at a bundle that we've generated before. So this is Docker app chart. You can see it has many different versions. It has 2 queries, in fact, associated with it. One searches for a Docker app, and one searches for the Helm chart that goes with that Docker image. And if I want to distribute it, I can just go with distribute version. And click distribute. And you can see the first 2 end really quickly because it had been distributed to them before. And the third one, it's showing me the progress as it moves through the distribution, moving each file one at a time. And in this case, I'm distributing out to a node that's not an edge node, but is a complete Artifactory when we talk about the Artifactory in India. But let's jump out to an edge node. Now, the interesting thing about the edge node is that the edge node isn't inside the circle of trust. So I can't use my SSO to access it. I can log in. And I can again see the release bundles from the bundles tab. If you've looked at a new Artifactory, you may have seen this bundles tab. This is what it's for. And I can see the same sort of data that we were seeing in distribution in terms of what artifacts are involved in the release bundle. And if I jump out to my Docker prod local, I can consume these artifacts using set me up, just like you would in a normal Artifactory. I can hit set me up, and it's going to tell me Docker pull a specific version. One of the other cool things about a release bundle on an edge node is that any artifact that's part of a release bundle cannot be deleted until you've deleted the release bundle first. So it's an immutable and traceable activity. So what have we seen? We've seen 4 challenges. Can you be data-driven and work across disparate tools with JFrog Insight? Can you scale complexity? We have JFrog Mission Control. How do you trust your software with JFrog Xray? How do you get your software binaries where they need to be with JFrog Distribution? And of course, all of these solutions are built on top of Artifactory. And they build out with a fairly solid architecture, right? So this is what a total Enterprise Plus architecture looks like for our customers. You have source control and CI, building artifacts into a main Artifactory that's being analyzed by Xray. Then it's pushed out through distribution to edge nodes in production locations throughout the globe, where it can then be deployed to the production runtime. And Mission Control and Insight are managing that process and tracking that process from start to finish. And Access is controlling the authentication and authorization in a global way that's fully federated so that user accounts make sense across the globe. Now, hopefully at this point, you're asking yourself, what do you need to do to use Enterprise Plus? Hopefully you've answered this question of, am I ready for Enterprise Plus? Do I need Enterprise Plus? And your answer is yes. And you're wondering what you can do about it. Well, you can contact your account manager. They'll be happy to set you up with a personalized discussion of Enterprise Plus. We have simple demos, by the way, that they can set you up with that allow you to test in the same sort of environment that you saw me running my test on. We have a simple cloud environment that you can go and try things out in for a couple of days and just see what it's like. We also have a simple version that you can take on-prem that will just run everything out with a full architecture like I showed you out of the box just to play with for a bit. Or maybe you want to do a more detailed POC. Have a discussion with us about what a proof of concept would look like for you. What of the things that we talked about do you need to prove? What do you need to see and show? And as part of that proof of concept, we'll introduce our high-touch solutions team to you, and they will work with you directly. So this is the same JFrog support teams that you're very familiar with and have hopefully had a good experience with, but taken to the next level, where they're going to be working with you very closely to make sure that your proof of concept is a success. And if you deploy into production, making it a success for you in production and in distributing your artifacts. Okay, so now we're ready for Q&A. Let's take a look at what we have for questions. So the first question that was asked was about JFrog Insight. And we were asked if build data can be presented if we also use Team City. So the demo I showed was related to a Jenkins server. What do you see if you're using TeamCity? So at the moment, it's a little bit more restricted. As I said, when we started, we really focused on the simplest architecture and the most common architecture, which was Jenkins, Git, Artifactory, and Xray. But a lot of the data comes from Artifactory. Most of the data, in fact, that you saw is actually gathered from Artifactory build info or from JFrog Xray. So if you're using TeamCity, that data is still available. A couple of the things that we pulled in, like the number of commits per build, that we aren't going to be able to get because that was we were using the Jenkins REST APIs for. But the majority of the data you saw in JFrog Insight will work with any CI server that you have, and over time, of course, we'll be adding the rest of those data as we can from the other CI server locations. So another person was also asking kind of along the same way about Insight. What other third-party tools are going to be supported with Insight? I think in general, what you'll see is that the third-party tools for Insight are going to map very closely to the ones that we work closely on for integrations with Artifactory. What is this core ecosystem capability? So somebody was just recently asking about TeamCity. Doubtless other CI servers will be included, direct information from the JFrog CLI, from Git. I can't speak to any specific individual tool that's going to be supported in what order they're going to be supported in. But if you're using it in the ecosystem, you know, let us know that it's something you care about, of course, but in general, that's going to be added. Had a question about distribution. Is distribution of artifacts limited only to release bundles? And is this separate from the existing sync replication feature in Artifactory? So the answer to both of these questions is yes. JFrog Distribution is just about release bundles, and it has its own replication mechanism that it uses to make sure that the replication of a release bundle is fully atomic. It does leverage some of the, in some cases, some of the replication capabilities of the main product, but it also has additional aspects to it. Some of the things that we do that's a little bit special in distribution may eventually move into standard Enterprise Plus replication activities. We're running it in a more controlled environment as a starting point. Being asked when JFrog Distribution will support pull replication as compared to current push replication. So at the moment, what distribution uses, what we call the replicator, is push-based. I don't know when we have plans to directly switch that, though if you want to use pull replication, you can use, instead of the distribution, you can of course still use standard replication. And we can talk to you later about specifics of your use case as to what might be appropriate. Please get in touch later. And we're being asked about, we have a mesh topology with read-only edge spokes, which sync data from hub using pull mechanism for CI purposes. Your Enterprise Plus Edge instance replace these, or do they need to remain as regular Enterprise instances? So at the moment, Edge nodes only do distribution. So if you're using you know, your pull mechanism to do kind of pull caching, at the moment that isn't what an Edge node is for. It's really only about the distribution process. So your current nodes that are read-only spokes probably will need to remain standard Artifactories. And then I got asked, what provisions do Artifactory servers have to handle high load and disaster recovery, especially in multi-cloud? So this is a great question. Artifactory Enterprise has been highly available for many years, and so it scales horizontally and vertically. And we have customers that are handling loads that constitute terabytes of traffic every day on Artifactory clusters. And of course, as you start talking about multi-cloud architectures, with the replication and the complex topologies we talked about, you also have the ability to handle not just a high load in a single place, but to distribute that load across many different places so that you have it very localized. This reduces overall burden on the network so that you're locally storing artifacts rather than trying to pull them across a WAN connection. You're pulling them off a LAN connection. And then as you need to scale for that LAN connection, you use the high availability feature to scale as you require. For disaster recovery, we're highly available. Standard solution in a cloud is to be highly available across zones in a region, and then to have a mesh topology across regions or across cloud providers in order to handle disaster recovery across clouds. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. I hope you found it useful and enjoyable. And I hope you follow up and learn more about Enterprise Plus and enjoy your time with it. Have a great day.